This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Keep watching to find out how to get free access. It's Q&A time. Thank you for all your Qs. I'll do as many As as I can. Instead of waiting for the customary 100K milestone, I say customary, but I've missed 1/3 of previous occasions. I thought I would do this at a special 420K subscriber landmark because it's a themed Q&A, and the theme of this one is drugs. And I left it fairly open-ended, but I think most of you will have interpreted that to be related to what is loosely defined as recreational drugs. I've got a little bit of an announcement regarding that, which will come in a second, but I will do some questions on other topics as well. So it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag, but I'm going to try and get through your drug-related questions. 420, for those that don't know, is a kind of code number for cannabis. For years, I assumed that this was related to the Indian slang for a scam, which is also 420, 420, but that comes from the penal code number, and actually they're nothing to do with each other. But on the subject of scams, let's start with a word that is not from the sponsor of this video.
Greetings, fellow alternative medicine practitioners. Now, who's here with me today? Hey, chiropractors, cracking to see you. Reiki crew, I can feel your energy. Naturopaths, whoa, there's a lot of you. Oh, you brought the anti-vaxxers with you. COVID's been a real shot in the arm for you guys, huh? Hey, functional medicine, welcome, great to see you. I gotta be honest, I didn't think you guys were one of us for a long time, but it was always inevitable you'd join our ranks. Now, traditional Chinese medicine, where you guys at? Wait, what are you doing down there? You couldn't get it upstairs? Oh, that's right, you killed the last rhino. Don't worry, just grind up some tigers, you'll be back in the game in no time, because being engorged is more important than being endangered, am I right? Oh, listen, talking of animals, the Indian delegation from the Ministry of Ayush is holding tonight's drinks. I just want to make you aware that the amber nectar they're serving, that's not actually beer. And of course, homeopathy is here in spirit. Now, friends, times are good. This so-called virus has driven millions of new customers into our arms, but we've got a problem. Even the vaccine skeptics, our bread and butter, are starting to realize that this vaccine works. Hospitalizations are down, deaths are down, people are starting to believe in evidence-based medicine once again. So that's why I want to tell you about Skillshare. Skillshare is a new service that non-evidence-based medical specialties can hire to turn people against conventional medicine and see them for the shills that we know they really are. Sign up for our premium package today, which includes pharma shills, only $C bills. Now, American healthcare is a mess, so it's important to highlight the very worst examples and make sure that everyone in every country is tarred with the same brush. We need people to believe that doctors get remuneration per medication. For some reason, people don't seem to understand that we also make money on all of our remedies, but if you suspect that a patient believes that someone online is genuinely trying to help them and debunk pseudoscience, you need to crush that notion. How to show that doctors don't think holistically. Now, orthodox doctors, or orthodoxters, that's what I call them, it's a little joke for you there, they don't think about the whole body, they're blinkered. Cardiologists don't even know what happens outside the heart. That one's actually true. All they know is how to prescribe. We are the true holistic therapists. Just take a look at chiropractors. They see the body as a whole by focusing exclusively on the spine. How to invent made-up diseases. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I've been diagnosing imbalances all over the shop recently. Chiro's ahead of the game again. Can I get a subluxation in here? But don't forget the classics, like chronic Lyme or adrenal fatigue. And the beauty of these is that doctors won't have heard of them, immediately exposing them as ignorant. And how to blame real disease on the sucker, the patient's doctor. Their shill doctor has filled them up to the eyeballs with toxic waste. They don't have cancer, they have big pharma poisoning. But don't worry, nothing 5 years of expensive supplements won't fix. Don't worry, they won't be around at the end to ask you why it didn't work. Sign up for Skillshare today, and we'll even convince people that this whole pandemic was engineered by the medical profession.
I said I had a little announcement, and actually I've got one of you to thank regarding this. I put a post out on the community tab a few weeks ago asking for your drug questions. And one of the people I was planning to talk about in the video is someone called Professor David Nutt, who is a pretty well-known name in the UK. And actually, he's a world expert in this field. And his work has been really inspirational to me. I've followed it for many, many years. And I've learned a great deal from his charity, Drug Science, that does research and puts out information. And Drug Science got in touch. And it was because one of you, a subscriber, had contacted them and told them that I was planning this video, told them about the channel, and they emailed me and offered to help. And so I'm very excited to say that I'm actually going to be interviewing Professor David Nutt next week. So I haven't seen any of the questions in advance. That's my sort of usual thing for Q&As. If I see any particularly good questions, I think I'm not going to answer them today. I'm going to save them for next week because, why would you get some sort of amateur who's just got a part-time interest in this rather than a genuine world expert in the field? We'll do a few today, and perhaps I'll concentrate on ones more from a personal kind of perspective as a practicing doctor in the UK, rather than tackling some of the more generic policy kind of questions or research questions, which I think he'll be much better placed to answer. So I'm going to start with questions from newsletter subscribers. This is an entirely cynical ploy to get more of you to subscribe. I've started up a newsletter very recently. I've only sent 2 issues out. I'm going to start with someone called Jennifer, because her email starts with, "Your accent sounded impeccable to me, and flattery will get you everywhere." So she's already my favorite questioner. I'd be really interested in your views on whether anything should be legal in the UK that currently isn't. I'll try and make this answer applicable to other countries as well. In the UK, we're slightly unusual case in that a lot of our legislation is still far less progressive than our European neighbours, comparable countries, and probably the most well-known example being Portugal, but other countries as well, like Holland or the Netherlands, have more progressive policies on a lot of these things. We're still incarcerating a lot of young people for drug-related offences, yet we have actually got slightly better laws when it comes to medicinal marijuana, and a lot of that is due to one woman, really, a remarkable lady whose son had refractory epileptic seizures and that exhausted many options, and she really fought to have legislation changed. So we actually have got this change in the law in recent years, but I think I'm not incorrect in saying that there have been the number of medicinal marijuana prescriptions in the UK since the law change is still in single figures. So it's not quite followed. I'm aware I haven't answered your question here, Jennifer. So the answer is I'm generally in favor of decriminalizing almost all drugs. And the differences between decriminalization and legalization, and I'm not a legal expert at all here, is that decriminalization means it is still illegal, but people are not criminalized for the use or possession of these drugs. And, my interest as a doctor in this is twofold, and why I've sort of had an interest for a long time. It started with a book chapter that I was asked to write about cardiovascular effects of drugs. And since then, I've just really kind of stayed very interested in the field. One is harm reduction, the societal and health impact of drugs. So, my role as a physician is to try and improve health of the population in whatever small way I can. So that's one of my interests, and why I believe that criminalizing people with addiction or for trivial drug offenses is not helping anybody. And the second interest I've got is research potential. There is a lot of promise now in the therapeutic applications of many different drugs, but to do that we need to be able to undertake research, and that requires a change in the law because it is extremely challenging for researchers to undertake academic rigorous research in the field. And I think what we're left with at the moment is a kind of situation where you've got people saying that CBD and DMT and psilocybin and all these kind of can just do anything. They'll solve all problems. And other people saying, that we shouldn't touch them and they're all profoundly dangerous. So I don't think anyone's really winning with the current system. I don't have any desperate strong feelings about legalization. I do think that, I was referring to the UK being a slightly funny example because there are more conservative countries in many aspects, like the USA, which have legalized not only medicinal but recreational marijuana in many places now. So I do find the UK's position slightly strange, but there doesn't seem to be an appetite for changing the law here at the moment. Before we continue, I want to say that one of my ambitions with achieving a certain seniority in my profession is to be able to talk about controversial topics. I feel it's very important to have medical professionals participating in a lot of different discussions, and certainly I have no interest in just addressing kind of bubblegum kind of topics. Having said that, I'm a practicing medical professional. I'm limited in what I can say. I think it goes without saying that nothing I talk about should be taken as medical advice. I've stated that on many occasions, somewhat jokingly, but when it comes to this kind of topic, the General Medical Council, which regulates doctors in the UK, has a very hardline view on anything to do with recreational drugs. I don't think I'm going to say anything particularly controversial, but I'd like to make it clear that in this video, I am not advising anybody to use illegal or recreational drugs. All of these things come with risks, and this is purely intended for educational purposes and should in no way be taken as endorsement of any of the substances that we discuss. Ethan asks, some drugs, the ones I think of are marijuana, LSD, and magic mushrooms, get touted as having minimal side effects, negative side effects. How true is this? And if it is, should these drugs be regulated closer to alcohol? That is, age limits, restrictions on certain activities, but generally legal. Well, I guess this is linked to the earlier question. We talked about marijuana then, so let's talk about LSD and magic mushrooms, which are kind of related and in the psychedelic category. I think if one is being totally objective, then it's clear that these have far lower negative side effect profiles than something like alcohol. And I referred earlier to work from the drug science team looking at total harm caused by drugs. And there's a fascinating breakdown, and hopefully I'll go into this with the prof, but there's a breakdown of the dangers of taking a drug for the first time and whether that can result in physical harm or death, and then chronic use. So, for example, heroin scores extremely highly on the risks from even a single use, because you can die on your first time, you can overdose. Whereas marijuana, LSD, and magic mushrooms, that really isn't possible. The same could be said for tobacco. But tobacco, clearly, chronic use is extremely harmful. And again, chronic use of these drugs is something we don't know about. And a recurrent theme through many of these questions will be, without undertaking research, decent research, good quality research into these drugs, we don't know a lot of questions, and particularly things like chronic use. But yes, if you were to compare, and based on that work, alcohol scores extremely badly for both personal health impact and also societal negative impact because of things like violence and ill health from an economic perspective, from a population perspective, and a huge amount of violence and what we call in the UK drunken disorderly behaviour comes back to alcohol and particularly domestic violence. There's a huge adverse effect profile for alcohol, and this is a common kind of question. If you could restart society, would you make alcohol illegal and other drugs legal? I think that's just kind of conjecture, but yeah, I think alcohol is far more harmful than a lot of drugs which are classed as illegal. And the second part of that question is whether they should be regulated. Yes, that's exactly the point of decriminalization or legalization, is to allow better regulation of these drugs. If you try to remove the criminal element from the use of drugs, if you accept that human beings since the beginning of time have sought different ways to alter their experiences, to take substances that change the way we sense the world, this appears to be something inherent to human nature, you can either take the prohibition approach, which has been shown through history to be unsuccessful, or you can accept it and adopt a harm reduction approach. And one of the tenets of harm reduction is regulation in terms of people don't know what they're getting. So sometimes you hear about drug-related deaths which are based on contaminants with drugs because they've been cut up with all kinds of other toxic substances, or sometimes it's actually they have got much more of the drug than they are used to. So they have got a pure form of the drug, something like fentanyl, for example, instead of it being cut with all the usual street sort of contaminants, they've got pure fentanyl and then taken far too much and died. So yes, again, regulation would go some way towards harm reduction. Anirudh asks, why are journals so hideously expensive? Why are they allowed to get away with it? All they do is publish the work. I mean, you know what I'm going to say here because I made a whole video about it. I think the whole industry stinks. I'm not sure if I should say that. Well, I'll keep it vague. But a common practice, and I've got direct experience of this, is that when you submit a paper, the journal will force you to cite more articles from that journal. And, they'll be pretty shameless about it. They'll write back with the review saying, if you could cite the following articles from that journal, and sometimes from a specific author who clearly is the reviewer in that case, to falsely inflate their impact factor and citation indices. And the whole thing is just extremely frustrating, and unfortunately has really put me off academia. That's just one aspect. I talk about others in the video about the scientific publication industry. It's ridiculously expensive, and it's this artificially inflated industry. Anirudh also asks, why do surgeons exist? Well, that's a sort of rather deep philosophical question, isn't it? I sometimes joke with junior doctors that we should be very grateful for orthopedic surgeons because without them, we wouldn't know about the complications that occur when an 85-year-old has a potassium of 9 or they go 3 days without any fluids. So, really it's a learning opportunity for the rest of us. This is a joke. I'm joking. That doesn't happen anymore. Historically, I think it is fair to say that these kinds of things did happen, but this is a long time ago. We now have much better joined-up care. Please don't cancel me. It's a joke. Tack asks, now that you're a consultant, when are we going to see that YouTuber mansion tour? Well, maybe not, but this probably is the last time you're going to see this studio because I'm moving. I'm moving out of London fairly soon and feeling a little emotional about it. I've been in London ever since I came to the UK as a kid. And this studio, I don't really feel like I've used it that much. I bet very few of you realise that I actually have quite a famous neighbour here. And Tack also asks, do you feel different to when you were a registrar in any way? Yes, older and more decrepit. Shivam asks, my question is related to psychedelics. I've watched many pop science videos on the topic and they all convey the same message that taking a psychedelic changes your experience completely. There are claims that it is proof of the supernatural world or some kind of transcendental world that is beyond our natural world. I want a rigorous medical answer to this fuss. He goes on a little bit longer there, and I quite agree. This kind of, we touched on earlier that there is a lot of woo regarding these drugs. It's great that there's a common conversation. You've got a lot of people with very big audiences like Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss who I think can hype things up a little bit. Then much more level-headed people who've spent large parts of their career looking into this, like Michael Pollan, the author who's written 2 books. How to Change Your Mind was a very landmark, influential book regarding psychedelics. And more recently, I haven't read this yet, but it's on my list, which is This Is Your Mind on Plants, where he talks, I think, about caffeine, opium, and mescaline. So, I think it's fantastic that people are talking about it, but unless we start really turning scientific rigor to this, there are going to be a lot of people, quacks, taking advantage of this. We've seen it with CBD. in that a lot of these products being sold are being marketed as being able to do all kinds of miracle cures. Jeff asks, I've seen studies that show how moderate alcohol use is correlated to longevity. Is there anything similar for cannabis, and how one would describe what an appropriate amount would be? There are kind of two parts of this question here. It's a very good question. The first is about moderate alcohol use being correlated to longevity. I actually made a TikTok video about this, and I'm quite lazy, so I'm just going to play you that now.
Why do we keep seeing headlines like this one that suggest that alcohol is protective? In the last couple of months, 2 studies have come out suggesting that people who drink zero alcohol actually do worse than people who drink moderately. And we hear the same kind of claims about chocolate and coffee and green tea. So what's going on? Obviously, heavy drinking is bad, but your risk goes down as you reduce how much alcohol you drink per day, but then goes up when you move from 1 or 2 a day to 0. That leads to journalists saying things like alcohol is protective, and that leads to chuggy memes. Remember, these are observational studies, and you can't establish causation when you're passively observing a population. Then there are confounders, subtle ways that groups might be different. People choose different reasons to stop drinking. For example, if you've got a long-term health condition or you're on medication, you might decide to give up alcohol. Having a relaxing glass of wine with a loved one in the evening may be a sign of being affluent, which is associated with better health outcomes. The wine is a symptom, not the cause.
If you're heading to TikTok now to add me, thank you very much. That's great, but please don't expect more than about 3 TikToks a year. Hopefully the point of that TikTok came across. So I take a lot of studies, whatever the substance is, but it's commonly repeated with alcohol, that suggest some correlation with longevity with a pinch of salt. Don't imply causality there. And then the second part of the question is anything similar for cannabis, and how would one determine what an appropriate amount would be? We don't know. We don't know if any amount of cannabis is entirely safe. The second part of the question is there anything similar for cannabis, and how would one determine what an appropriate amount would be? No, there isn't anything similar that suggests correlation with longevity for any amount of cannabis. It would be incorrect to say that there is evidence that there is any safe amount of cannabis, but it is probably comparable to alcohol in that it is a dose-dependent risk. Cannabis is often taken with tobacco. We know that removing the tobacco makes the risk profile better, lower risk. B asks, which famous world leader, let's stick with the deceased to not sully current reputations, I wasn't aware you could sully current politicians' reputations any further, would have benefited from the use of either a pharmaceutical or a recreational drug? One of the greatest atrocities of the 20th century was in Cambodia, where the brutal Khmer Rouge's regime resulted in many deaths, and their leader, a vicious man, could really have used a bit of a smoke. I think he could have just chilled out and I think would have benefited from some weed, which is ironic because his name was Pol Pot. Lynn asks, I've just looked at this, quite a long email, but it's pretty interesting, so I'll read it. They are a volunteer with the ambulance service, and my query relates to the effects of these drugs. They attended a cardiac arrest of a 26-year-old who had apparently taken some drugs. While carrying out CPR, the patient opened their eyes, stared at me, tried to grab my arm and pull at the BVM, the bag valve mask, oxygen mask. However, on ceasing CPR, to check the rhythm, you pause the chest compressions every 2 minutes and check whether pulse has returned. The patient went flaccid with no response or pulse. This somewhat disturbed me, as none of the arrests I had done before or since have had that reaction. I've had patients revive but not had this level of consciousness followed by complete unconsciousness due solely to CPR. The patient was transferred to hospital with ongoing CPR. Unfortunately, they died. I did read something later that cocaine only acts on the heart, unlike opioids that affect respiration. So providing the heart is kept pumping well, the person can wake up during CPR, and the effects of cocaine will eventually wear off with minimal side effects apart from mechanical CPR. Okay, I'll get to that second bit, but this phenomenon of waking up during cardiac arrest, I first saw on ER, I think, years ago in one of the latest series of ER, so I'd kind of stopped watching by then. If I haven't mentioned to you before on this channel, I think the first 5 seasons of ER are the finest medical television, or at least joint finest with Scrubs. Later on, I wasn't watching so much, but there was one scene that was brought to my attention, so I watched the episode where somebody during CPR woke up, and there's mechanical CPR. I mean, all CPR is mechanical, but it's person powered normally, but we have these devices which you attach to the chest, and they perform CPR. And of course, the great advantage is that they don't get tired. CPR is hard work, and humans fatigue easily, and chest compressions become worse and worse. And they can provide much better cardiac output than humans can. In this storyline, somebody woke up, and I just thought this was kind of artistic license. But I've never seen this myself. Some colleagues of mine have. They've said that patients have almost regained enough consciousness to even speak, which I find a very difficult thought, because they are, I couldn't even imagine what that's like if, particularly if they don't make it, like in this case. I don't know what level of consciousness they achieve. From this email, it's also not entirely clear, but it must be incredibly painful to have that machine going on your chest, and just very terrifying to know what's going on. So that's gone a bit kind of grim. The second part of this, Lynn had mentioned about cocaine affecting the heart, unlike opioids that affect respiration. And that is true. Opioids tend to cause death via respiratory depression, whereas cocaine, I mean, it's quite possible that in this case, the cocaine was the causative agent of the cardiac arrest. Cocaine can cause a sympathetic toxidrome. You have very high levels of catecholamines. It can also cause platelet aggregation and blood clot formation. So it's quite possible that cocaine was the cause of the cardiac arrest. So I'd be a bit apprehensive or dubious of suggesting that cocaine may be beneficial. It kind of sounds like this is the question that, did the cocaine allow this regain in consciousness to take place? I'd be surprised if that's because we give massive doses of adrenaline during cardiac arrest anyway. So I don't think that the cocaine would be that relevant at that point if somebody's already had a cardiac arrest. Opiates, on the other hand, we try and there are reversal agents. Cocaine, there is no reversal agent for that. So I think the simple answer is I don't know, but that phenomenon apparently does exist. Sarah asks, now that we've recently watched the Olympics, what sport do you think would be the funniest to watch if it required the competitors to be drunk? My money would probably be on the modern pentathlon. That's the one where you ride a horse, sword fight, run, shoot guns. I mean, that's going to be a joke if everybody's drunk. It's going to be a riot. Then again, that's just a Friday night at East London, isn't it? Julian asks, I once heard about a study about male ejaculate soothing sore throats or even curing strep throats. I wondered, in case it might be true, if the reason has something to do with the sperm's acrosome reaction. Julian. Men of the world who publish these papers, please stop trying to drag science into your war of attrition with your girlfriend. She's either going to do it or she isn't. These kind of bullshit studies that claim some health benefit from sperm are not convincing anybody. Well, actually, there was, I think from China, a story where a guy convinced his girlfriend that it had anti-aging properties, and she applied it to her face for quite a long time before realizing the truth. So please, just... Orn asks, I've heard a few cases of sudden heart attacks because his heart was too big. Is that really a thing? What makes it stop beating in such instances? Well, that's a very good question. Yes, it is a thing. I remember when I started medical school, we were all assigned a cadaver, which we would learn from for that year. And when we looked in the chest in my naivety, and I was brand new in medical school, I saw this enormous heart and I thought, wow, this guy must have been like a marathon runner, which of course was a completely stupid comment, because yes, elite athletes can get enlarged hearts, but nothing to that extent. And when you get really enlarged hearts, it's almost always due to a pathological process. In that case, it was congestive cardiac failure, which is a very common cause of heart failure. Well, actually, that's not a cause. That's a sort of umbrella term. You can get many different types of heart failure, from narrowed coronary arteries to alcohol abuse, other drugs. This is the theme of the Q&A. You can get viral infections. You can get genetic abnormalities that cause it. You can get congenital abnormalities, so the heart structure develops incorrectly. And all of these can cause the heart to expand. And the problem with that is that the whole architecture of the heart gets changed. So the heart pumps much less efficiently, and then below a certain point of impairment, your risk of sudden cardiac death starts rising quite rapidly. And this is because of, quite complex reasons, but essentially the electrical system in the heart, it becomes more likely to have essentially kind of short circuits, and you can get abnormal firing of the heart. You're predisposed to have a ventricular arrhythmia like ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia, because the muscle itself, the actual tissue of the heart, is pathological. You can get micro scarring or macro scarring. You can get fibrofatty infiltration, you can get myocardial disarray of all the cells. So there are multiple reasons why people have an enlarged heart, and they can all predispose to sudden cardiac death. So that's a very good question. Peter Morn asks, if you were to find yourself in a room full of doctors doing a bit of recreational wacky-backy, which specialist group would be the most fun, and why is it not dermatologists? It's a little bit harsh to dermatologists. I'm not sure they deserve to be bottom of the pile. I know they'd probably be lighting their spliffs with a wad of cash, but I think the most fun would probably be psychiatrists. And that's maybe coloured by the fact that I think almost all psychiatrists I know have tried at least some drugs. But I think psychiatrists put the wacky in backy. I'm friends with lots of them, and whilst I wouldn't do it as a career, I find the field really interesting, and they are just generally quite interesting people, and I think they'd have a lot of mind-expanding conversations. Justin Davis asks, as a doctor, what are your thoughts on the idea of broad drug legalization and regulation, specifically as it translates to the health outcomes of occasional or habitual substance users, the idea being you know what you're taking with encouraged access to safe spaces? Well, I guess we've already touched on this, but let me try and expand a little bit by talking about some other examples of harm reduction through history, which is essentially the motivation behind regulation and people knowing what they're getting. For example, methadone prescription for opiate addicts. You're still giving them a very strong substance, but you are trying to reduce the harm from the use of needles or needle exchanges, because, again, these are lessons from history. A lot of the harms were caused by dirty needles. So if you can provide people with clean needles, you're mitigating that risk. You're not encouraging people to do drugs. They were very controversial, and there's a lot of political history here that maybe I'll also try and get into with Professor Nutt about how the war on drugs. And I think the best quote about the war on drugs comes from The Wire.
Girl, you can't even call this shit a war.
Why not?
Wars end.
There is a bit of a double standard here, because when patients are admitted with, conventional kind of diseases. So if somebody comes in with a heart attack to see me, and that heart attack's been brought on by lifestyle choices, maybe they work as a stockbroker in the city, or they smoke or something like that. There's no moral judgment. You treat the heart attack and you attempt to mitigate their risk in future by prescribing all the drugs that I prescribe. So why are we not doing the same thing for diseases caused by the misuse of substances? Other examples from history aren't even related to drugs. Things like the Catholic Church's historic opposition to contraception and abortion. The solution was abstinence. But just like prohibition, it just doesn't work. You have to accept that people are going to do it and try and reduce the risk. Lachlan I think, asks, why are so many in the medical field beladen with drug addictions and dependence? Good question. There is a problem with addiction within the medical profession. And I've read conflicting things in terms of numbers, but it appears that there is a greater degree of addiction within doctors compared to the general population. And some of that is related to the job. It's clearly a stressful job. One deals with death and illness on a regular basis. But, of course, there are other stressful jobs as well. However, medics are a bit more unusual, and this is also why we see it overrepresented amongst vets, for example, is access to drugs. And obviously, anybody in the general public has access to alcohol. The same is true for doctors. So alcohol remains the number one substance that is abused and people have addiction to. But compared to the general population, use of things like opiates, fentanyl, other painkillers, benzodiazepines, sedatives is much higher amongst doctors. And if memory serves, anaesthetists have the highest rate because they use these drugs on a regular basis, whereas some of the rest of us will use them less frequently, so they have easier access. Having said that, my own experience of how this process works in hospital is that it's pretty thorough these days. And I know hospitals do things differently, but everywhere I've worked, if I want to prescribe a controlled drug, as it's known, something like morphine or fentanyl or midazolam, it has to be taken out of a locked storage unit with a nurse and myself, or two nurses will have to sign it out. And if I'm the prescriber, I will have to check the serial number of the ampule being used. We then have to count all the ampules left together independently and then corroborate our number. Both have to countersign in a book. So, there are multiple levels of securities, which is why I find it almost impressive when doctors come up with schemes like a friend of a friend in another country who recently has had a lot of career problems because of addiction, and they were using some sort of micro drill, I think some sort of watchmaker's drill, to go through the glass of a fentanyl ampule and drain the fluid, and then seal it with some sort of special glass sealant, which marks for creativity there. And of course, the major concern with a doctor and addiction is impact on their fitness to practice. So this is one of the most common reasons for investigating a doctor that is not performing up to the right standard. And if I did have to single out one of the things that we've talked about, alcohol, I feel is, because of its societal acceptance, almost given a pass. If somebody is found to be using some other sort of drug, I think there'd be a lot of immediate concern and people would report that straight away. But I think when it comes to alcohol, particularly at a junior level, there's a culture of binge drinking, which is inherent to a lot of medicine, and I think people just kind of don't consider it in the same way. Having said all that, I think the younger generation, mirroring the population at large, younger millennials, not geriatric ones like me, and Generation Z, are just far less into drinking, and smoking is extremely rare. I think that is progress, certainly amongst my juniors. I don't find that they're big drinkers at all. Their name is here, I'm going to disguise it just reading the question. KS asks, I'm a fresh graduate and as a med student I did my deed of weed. It personally helped with the stress during exams and internship. Now as a young doctor about to start practicing, this is a no-brainer. What can we do to allow more of its benefits to safely and legally reach healthcare staff with anxiety, PTSD, depression, and so on, without it affecting their practice or annoying those damn hospital lawyers? Yes, so medicinal marijuana, as we've mentioned, is legal in the majority of US states, for example. It technically is legal to prescribe medicinal marijuana in the UK, but as I mentioned earlier on, it's not really been done very much, and it is also in quite specific cases, not those kinds of indications here, but in America, I imagine there must be some medical professionals who are receiving a legal prescription for marijuana. I really don't know what the reaction of hospital lawyers or boards would be if a medical professional through legal means was using cannabis. I think there's still a great deal of social stigma. So that's a really interesting question. I don't know what the reaction would be if a doctor said, I am using this prescription. I only do it on Saturday night, not anywhere near when I'm working. I don't know what the reaction would be there. Ryan asks, is there any truth to different kinds of drunk from different alcohol? People say they get horny with tequila or angry with whiskey or sad with wine. Why is that? Is there any basis to it? I've never heard that before. I can't imagine that is true. There are, of course, different constituents along with ethanol. Ethanol is the active ingredient in alcohol that gets you drunk, but there are lots of other things that go with it, and there are certain old wives' tales about dark alcohol and clear alcohol and giving different effects or different hangovers. And as far as I know, I don't think there's a lot of truth to most of those. This sounds like it probably comes from the same school of thought as the guy who said that male ejaculate cures strep throat and was just trying to excuse some dodgy behavior. BP asks, thoughts on using drugs for academic advantages like microdosing psychedelics or using stimulants to gain an advantage? Should this be more regulated like doping is in sports, or is this not a real problem? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I know a few years ago there was a lot of interest in nootropics and people were talking about that a lot. I think now psychedelics seem to have occupied a lot of the same people talking about the potential for these things. Things like modafinil was quite popular a few years ago. I haven't been following the scene very closely. I don't know if use is that high, but certainly at one point study drugs use was reported quite highly amongst college students in the US. From what I've seen, I think it's not really lived up to the hype, so to speak. And so I'm not sure that doping is particularly an issue. I think, you could make similar arguments about caffeine in terms of the actual effect it has on ability to study, in that it's unlikely to be all positives with no negatives. And I think overall the benefits are limited. In terms of microdosing psychedelics, this again, is a hot topic at the moment. Again, we're in a kind of evidence-free zone. We're going on a lot of anecdotal data, a lot of people saying it worked for them. So I again wouldn't be able to give you any advice on the matter. Liam asks, do you think doctors or nurses should be subject to drug tests? Is drug abuse something you've seen in the NHS among staff? In answer to the first question, no, I don't think doctors or nurses should be subject to drug tests. I don't think most people should be subject to drug tests, because what are you actually testing? Are you testing acute intoxication? In the most cases, no. If you breathalyze someone, you're testing acute alcohol toxicity. But a lot of these drug tests stay positive for a long while, so that's not really telling you anything. It's not telling you that if the person is abusing the drug. There are, of course, tests for acute use, and that's different. But, when people talk about drug tests like this, random drug testing from strands of hair or whatever, that I don't think it's giving you any useful information. If you are suggesting that is something to be acted on, what you're saying is that any use of these drugs should be taken as a proxy for you being unfit to do your job, which I don't think there's any evidence to support that at all. The drug abuse is something you've seen in the NHS among staff. Yes, we talked about this earlier. Yeah, it certainly exists, and it is most commonly alcohol. And I think alcohol is not treated as seriously as it should be. Leo asks, have you considered making a mistakes in my videos episode like Sam from Wendover? This would be ample material to dazzle us with your self-deprecating British humour. Self-deprecating? No, I haven't considered making a mistakes in my videos episode because I've never made a mistake. There are quite a few questions here that are clearly just people asking very specific personal advice. I'm skipping over those. And there are also other questions which are really good, but they're kind of similar to ones we've already tackled. So I apologize if I didn't get to your question, but I think obviously there is a big overlap, a lot of questions about legalisation and research and things like that. And of course, remember that I am saving some of these for Professor Nutt. JK asks, as someone who lives in Europe, it's very common for everyone to drink after they're 14 and party every week. What are the side effects of doing drugs and drinking alcohol when you're young? Personally, I'm 16 and I don't drink, but it's holding me back socially, as I'm the only person I know at my age who doesn't drink. So I'm wondering how much it will mess me up to drink a bit every week? Well, first of all, I would not recommend anybody to break the law and drink alcohol underage. I certainly don't think you should feel that you're being held back socially because of alcohol. I was, I drank as a teenager at medical school, but I was never a big drinker, and my circle of friends didn't really revolve around drinking, and I'm still friends with all of them, years later. So don't feel pressurized into doing anything you don't want to do, whether that's alcohol or anything else. But in answer to your question, whether drinking on a weekly basis is harmful, we know that the main harm from chronic alcohol use is if you drink above the recommended weekly limit on a regular basis. Also, the harms of drinking at a young age are probably more significant than later on, particularly while the brain is still developing. There's an emerging body of science that says not just alcohol but other drugs as well. In the teenage years, as the brain is still developing, you might be sort of fully grown, but you're still undergoing quite a lot of development in your higher functions, can be harmful. So if you are going to drink, you should allow gaps between drinking. And that can be a few days. It doesn't have to be sort of weeks. But when you drink, you shouldn't binge drink. And that tends to be the tendency for young people, that they binge drink, that they will go out and drink many, many drinks at the weekend, and then they won't have anything till the following weekend and feel that, that's fine. And the risk for things like liver cirrhosis and things like that, and a lot of the nutritional deficiencies that occur with chronic alcoholism are less when you do it that way. But it's entirely incorrect to think that binge drinking is safe. Kartoff asks, what would you think about an athletic competition where the winning condition isn't to be the fastest, but to be the one that has the most improvement when drugged compared to without using substances? I personally think it would be dope. I need to get better at weeding out these questions. Chris Alot, you have to pick one and the other disappears forever. Aspirin or paracetamol? You'd think that as a cardiologist, I'd instantly disappear paracetamol because aspirin is so widely prescribed in cardiology, and of course is taken by millions of people around the world prophylactically and as secondary prevention, so once they've already had heart trouble. But I'm a really big fan of paracetamol. It's pretty much the only medication I take myself. And even then, rarely. I mean, most doctors, I think, are not the ones that are addicted to things, but the rest of us are quite loath to taking tablets, and we try not to take medications. But, if I'm feeling lousy, then I've personally found paracetamol very effective. So it's either the benefit of millions of people worldwide or my own personal lack of tolerance for discomfort. It's a tough balance, but I think I'll probably keep aspirin. Sanandan asks, have medical emergencies in airplanes reduced significantly now that you aren't taking many flights? Yes, I think they've ground to a halt, but that might change. I'm taking not one, but 2 flights in 2 days in a few weeks, and more will be revealed in time. A large amount of time has passed between the last question and now. I just had to do a long work call. It's now the evening and I'm late for dinner, but I'm going to quickly do a few more. I think I was going to do this one from Saul. My phone's now attached to the charger, so I have to lean over here. I've spent a large portion of my career working with people who use drugs and find that in the US at least, one of the biggest barriers they have to care is poor treatment from healthcare staff, including physicians and nurses. I know this population can be difficult to work with, but it seems like medical staff often make the situation worse through their own stigmatizing and dismissive behavior. Do you believe this is a problem in the UK? A bit more serious question there. Yes, is the short answer. I believe it's probably common to all health systems that there is an inherent stigma towards drug use. I'm sure I've been guilty of this myself. I mean, I've been a doctor a long time now, and I have hopefully grown as a doctor and become better. I'm confident that I have. I will admit that I think early on, you have received attitudes that you just take on without really questioning. There are many biases within medicine. I've talked about a lot on this channel before. And there absolutely is a stigma towards drug users, and I think we've talked about some of these topics already. IV drug users are a common patient group that I interact with because it's very common, well, not, but they are at much higher risk of developing infections in the bloodstream and particularly in the heart, which is called infective endocarditis. There's an interesting bit of trivia why they tend to get right-sided infections in the heart, because all infective endocarditis tends to originate through some sort of break in the skin so that bugs can infiltrate into the bloodstream. So if it was just to do with the fact that these bugs were draining into the heart on the right side, then all infective endocarditis would prefer the right. But it seems to be much more common in IV drug users, and that's because of particulate matter in the stuff they're injecting, so impurities, or if there are little crystals in there. So you get these contaminants. Talc is a classic that's cut in with heroin, and when they inject it, the micro abrasions and trauma caused by this particulate matter hit the right-sided valve first, the tricuspid valve, typically on the right side of the heart, and then they get sort of stuck in the lungs, so they don't go to the left side. And those little abrasions and trauma on the surface of the tricuspid valve is what makes bugs stick to that valve. But that's kind of a real tangent there. Sorry, I tend to sort of rant about cardiology when my mind goes a bit too fast. So in answer to the question, yes, certainly there is stigma. I'm sure I've been guilty of this myself. I was talking about IV drug users, and I think as a young doctor, I did have the impression as like, well, if you just stop doing this, then it won't happen, which is just such a simplistic and judgmental way of looking at things. So hopefully I have improved. I think I have. Barris asks, who by the way has a excellent channel that you should check out. If weed is a depressant and cocaine a stimulant, is there a proper dose of both that would fully counteract each other's effect? And if yes, is there a way to calculate that ratio? Asking for a friend. It doesn't work like that. Barris's friend, absolutely not a plant, asks, can you do the sponsor bit now? Yes, why not? Good question. One of the greatest things about medicine as a career, and this isn't exclusive to medicine at all, but it's something that brings me a lot of satisfaction, is that even this old dog, half deaf, lame, losing his fur, can still learn new tricks. In fact, I have to. It's essential for my job to continually learn, and I'll be doing that for the rest of my career. And that, really is something that I find very rewarding about medicine. And if I'm perfectly blunt, I find it hard to click with people that aren't interested in learning new things. So a lot of my friends are similarly minded to me, and I've actually got a bunch of them onto Skillshare who found it really useful to discover new things or explore interests that they already had, and they are very kindly sponsoring this video. Skillshare, that is, not my friends. My friends, I think, assume all YouTubers earn millions of dollars, so there's no chance of them sponsoring me. Skillshare is more than tutorials or courses. It's an online community of lifelong learners like I aspire to be, and I personally really enjoy the creative stuff they have on there, like music, illustration, photography, video, stuff that I haven't had a chance to really explore as much as I'd like to in my day job and life up till now. But there's loads that I haven't checked out yet. I've had some really nice comments on my videos that the production quality is steadily getting a bit better, slowly. I know it's nothing special, but I do it all myself, and any improvements I have had are in no small part due to Skillshare and stuff that I've learned there. The classes are mostly under an hour long, so they kind of fit around busy schedules. They're constantly coming out with lots of new premium classes. There are no adverts, and there's absolutely no chance you'll run out of things to dive into. I really like Mimi Chow's Introduction to Digital Painting, which uses both Procreate and Photoshop, and I quite like that because I'm much more familiar with the latter. I've always quite liked to draw. I'm not particularly good or anything, but I've never made that transition to digital. And out of several beginner courses that I've taken, I thought Mimi's was an excellent starter with really useful tips about how to set up Procreate, for example, to do what you want to do. Another one I've really enjoyed is how to grow houseplants, vegetables, and herbs with Ekta Chaudhary. My wife and I seem to have a terrible track record of just killing anything that attempts to grow in our flat. So I thought, this is a bit left field for me, but I thought I'd really give it a try and I also thought that was excellent. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description box will get a month free access to Skillshare, so you can start exploring your creativity today. Check it out, find a new passion, and remember, I prefer for you to get something via the sponsors rather than asking for money, because I'll just spend it on drugs research books. Hey, actually, do you think I should make a Skillshare course? I've had this vague idea for a course. I'm not really sure it'll work. So without prejudicing you and telling you what I was thinking of, is there any course that you would want to take from me? There you go, turning the Q&A back onto the Q-tioner.